Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Next week is the 78th anniversary of the Battle of Midway, one of the major turning points in World War II. I'm going to walk you through some of my favorite facts about the battle. While the Japanese were expanding at this point in the war to create as many concentric island rings of defense between themselves and the United States as possible, the reason they were targeting Midway and hoping it would be a decisive battle stemmed largely from the Doolittle raid earlier in April. American aircraft carriers were able to launch a strike on Tokyo that even endangered the Emperor. This looked really bad for the Navy, who had been talking about how they'd been winning battle after battle throughout the war, which of course they had been. The United States had been pushed all the way back to its most inner ring of island defenses. If the Japanese were able to take Midway Atoll, it is one of the westernmost of the Hawaiian Islands. They could have aircraft within range of the fleet base at Pearl Harbor. That might push their operational fleet all the way back to the west coast of the United States and severely delay any offensive operations that the U.S. could take. The Japanese planned a huge and convoluted battle plan for taking the island. They had a superior fleet at this point. The American industry had not built up enough ships to make up for the losses at Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese squandered that, thinking that they were going to have surprise on their side. They sent some of the carriers and other ships up to the Aleutian Islands to capture a couple of relatively unimportant islands up there and bomb a minor U.S. base at Dutch Harbor. The aircraft carriers, the Kido Butai, were going to provide the bulk of the strike force, and they were going to attack Midway Island itself. Because of the earlier Battle of Coral Sea, two of Japan's most modern and powerful aircraft carriers had been taken out. One was damaged, the other one was completely fine, but her air group had been shot up. Japan did not switch air groups between their carriers, and this rendered the entire carrier inoperational for this huge battle. The United States, on the other hand, were able to get one of their carriers, which had survived the Battle of the Coral Sea, albeit damaged. They were able to get Yorktown back to Pearl Harbor, repair her in just 3 days, a Herculean effort, and then grab the air group from the damaged aircraft carrier Saratoga to replace the aircraft that had been destroyed at Coral Sea and pilots, and they were able to send Yorktown to battle. The Japanese were bringing 4 aircraft carriers, but their air groups had been depleted over the first 6 months of the war. And the Japanese training pipeline, they trained their pilots harder than the United States, but it meant it took longer. U.S. pilots got the bulk of their training after they learned how to fly through first-hand experience. So their actual training was less, and then they would be deployed and they would do small raids to get experience so that by the big battles, they had really good experience. The U.S. also rotated its pilots out. So some would go home to train with lessons they had learned, the new generation, while others would stay on the front line. The Japanese, and other Axis powers for that matter, tended to just leave their pilots on the front line for the entire war. And eventually, the cream of their crop got killed off. In addition to the carrier force, there was an invasion force that was coming up with the transports that also needed some carrier cover. There was a battleship force that was screening in case the American battleships came out to defend the island. Or if they were able to cripple American ships, then the battleships could sweep in and sink them. And then there was a cruiser force operating completely independently that was going to bombard the island with 8-inch guns prior to the actual land invasion. With all of these moving pieces, it meant that none of their fleets could support one another. On the United States side, we were sending 2 carrier task forces. One under the command of Raymond Spruance, which had previously been commanded by Admiral Halsey. However, he was sick at the time. Focused around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Hornet was relatively new, but Enterprise had already done some island raids. A second squadron under Admiral Fletcher came in with the aircraft carrier Yorktown. The Japanese were expecting to attack Midway, that to be a surprise for the Americans, and then the Americans to show up sometime after the invasion had already occurred. In fact, the United States had broken the Japanese JN-25 naval code and knew that an attack was coming on Midway Island. They had reasonable suspicion. Not everybody was convinced. Back home in Washington, there was concerns that this was a ruse and that the Japanese were going to actually attack the West Coast. Admiral Nimitz believed in his intelligence gathering community, headed by Lieutenant Commander Rochford at this point, and offered that he would leave the battleships of Task Force 1, which we covered in a previous video, check the description down below to see that, to cover the west coast of the United States, while he took the carriers to Midway to ambush the Japanese. The battle began with the American carriers sailing towards a rendezvous point they called Point Luck. From there, to the north of Midway, they could ambush the Japanese. They had to find them first. The island had been reinforced with a number of defenders, anti-aircraft batteries, and every aircraft that could be scraped up. It ended up being a mixed match of old, obsolete aircraft, like old Vindicator dive bombers, Devastator torpedo bombers, and also modern state-of-the-art aircraft like the new Avenger. 6 of these were sent, not even a full squadron's worth, even though they hadn't been fully deployed yet. Catalina flying boats from Midway were able to find several of the different Japanese formations, and bombers from Midway were able to attack, all relatively inconclusively. Meanwhile, the Japanese, not knowing that the Americans could be there yet, launched an attack on Midway itself to try and neutralize the defenses. Previously in the war, their surprise attacks had devastated the defenders and were followed up by easy invasions. Not so at Midway. So the aircraft reporting battle damage to the site there had to announce that they hadn't disabled the island's airfields or their shore defenses. So a second attack was going to be needed. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Japanese fleet, the carrier fleet, decided that, okay, that's reasonable, we've still had no word from the Americans, even though he had scout aircraft of his own out. So they began arming a second wave, which had been held in reserve in case American warships showed up, from using armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes to having high-explosive bombs. By this point, the American aircraft from their carriers had already taken off and were headed towards the Japanese. A Japanese scout plane that was launched late and had some radio difficulties was able to find one of the American carrier forces, but the information didn't get to Nagumo at an actionable time. Meanwhile, the first of the American carrier planes started attacking. Had the Americans been well-trained and coordinated, the plan would have been that all of their aircraft go in at once. The torpedo bombers coming in at wave top height, while the dive bombers come in from above, and the fighter planes screen them. Because the position of the Japanese fleet was not well known, the various squadrons showed up haphazardly. So squadrons from the various aircraft carriers just showed up whenever they could find the Japanese fleet. They didn't have the fuel to loiter and collect their fighter escorts or wait for other squadrons to show up. Somehow the slow torpedo planes got lucky and found the Japanese first. They immediately pressed the attack. The old Devastator torpedo bombers that the United States Navy was still using at this point were pretty obsolete. They were good in 1939, they were good in 1940, but by 1942, they were too slow-moving to be able to protect themselves against concentrated anti-aircraft fire or the Japanese carriers' combat air defense. All three American torpedo bomber squadrons were able to find the Japanese, and all three of them were destroyed. Very few aircraft and aircrew were able to return. Their sacrifice, though, did draw down the Japanese combat air patrol from orbiting high up above the carriers to wave-top heights, which meant when the next American squadrons arrived on scene, the Dauntless dive bombers in this case, at extremely high altitude, there was nobody up there to contest them. Anti-aircraft fire has much more trouble at high angles than firing a torpedo bomber, and so they were able to press the attack and disable and eventually sink 3 of the Japanese aircraft carriers in a single strike. Unfortunately, not all of the American planes found the Japanese carriers, and not all of them found their way home. Those American pilots who had fought in a battle before, say the ones from Yorktown or Enterprise who had participated in Coral Sea or the Central Islands raids, had some training and experience, and they knew what they were doing. The pilots from Hornet had a rough time of it, and some just disappeared over the Pacific and were never seen again. At this point, the Japanese could have called off the mission and saved one of their modern carriers. These ships were irreplaceable. However, they chose to continue to persecute the fight. Admiral Nagumo's flagship Akagi had been sunk, so Admiral Tamaguchi took over. He was an aggressive man, and he launched a strike on the last known position of the American carriers. This strike was able to find the American carriers Yorktown, and they were able to press their attack against 5-inch guns like these and do serious damage to Yorktown. Yorktown had previously been damaged at the Coral Sea, but this meant that her damage control parties were really experienced. They were able to repair all the damage and continue to operate the ship. Tamaguchi's strike returned, was rearmed, and sent out again. Again, they found the unlucky Yorktown, and somehow Enterprise and Hornet were able to avoid them. And again, they were able to press the attack and damage Yorktown. These were the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, and they probably had the best aircraft in the world at the time. But again, Yorktown's repair party was able to make repairs. The Japanese believed that they had disabled 2 separate American carriers, and they believed that Yorktown was already out of action. So this should mean that they had destroyed the entire American fleet. In fact, they hadn't. American dive bombers, primarily from Enterprise, were able to catch the last Japanese carrier and sink her too. While Nagumo survived, Tamaguchi went down with his ship. A major contributing factor to the loss of the Japanese carriers was that they were changing out ordnance, switching from bombs that were good against anti-ships to bombs that were good against land targets and back again. And they were actively refueling and launching aircraft at the time of the attack. This meant that their ammunition was not secured in magazines, and sometimes 1 or 2 hits from an American plane that shouldn't have been fatal resulted in the loss of the ship. Japanese damage control practices also weren't as effective as American. There are a number of reasons for this, but one that I attribute a lot to: the Americans had been having their teeth kicked in for 6 months, and they had learned some lessons on damage control. The Japanese hadn't actually taken significant damage up to this point, and so they didn't have the same level of experience with that. Following this, Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the battleship force and the entire combined fleet, had not yet decided it was time to withdraw. Still thought he had destroyed enough American carrier planes that his battleships could destroy any of them and soften up the island. He might have been true about that. There weren't many carrier planes left. However, he wisely chose, having lost most of his air support, to withdraw. Not before some of his heavy cruisers strayed into range of the American carrier planes and were sunk. One was sunk, one was damaged. The Americans, having no aircraft left and having defended Midway Atoll, withdrew to Pearl Harbor. Yorktown and Enterprise went at best speed so they could rearm for a future campaign. With a victory under their belt, America was going to go on the offensive. Yorktown, having been damaged twice, was making best possible speed back to Pearl Harbor when on June 7th, a couple days after the battle, she was found by a Japanese submarine that had followed the leaking oil from torpedo damage. This submarine was able to penetrate the American carrier screen and put torpedoes into both the escorting destroyer Hammond and the carrier Yorktown. Yorktown was abandoned because at this point she'd been damaged 3 times, plus the not fully repaired Coral Sea damage. But she didn't sink, so damage control efforts resumed. However, by the next morning, she had taken on enough water that she capsized and sank. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions, drop them down below in the comment section. If you'd like notifications when we post new videos, like, share, subscribe, and click the bell icon. And if you'd like to support the museum and our channel, check out the description down below for ways you can donate.